today. Christine Hayes, it's great to have such a distinguished scholar on the topic here. The floor is open to you.
Thank you very much. I'll be talking about the complicated goy in biblical and rabbinic sources. And this talk has somewhat of a synthetic quality to it. And as I was listening to all of these talks, bells kept ringing, and I kept wanting to go back and refer to some of these people here in this section. So hopefully you'll be able to do that work for me, because there are many ways in which this paper ties together so much of what's been presented in the last couple of days. So human communities are generally predicated on concepts, on generalized concepts of identity and alterity, of self and other, as we've been talking about. Concepts that enable a community to inscribe and police its boundaries. However, personal encounters with particular others contest a community's generalized concepts of self and other and destabilize community boundaries, which is sort of a fancy way of saying we all have stereotypes and they get blown up by the individual people that we meet over and over again, right? Ancient Israelite or Jewish community was predicated on the maintenance of a generalized and abstract distinction between Israelite or Jewish identity and non-Israelite or non-Jewish alterity. And yet, personal encounters, and we'll leave for a moment aside the question of whether they're real or imagined, but personal encounters with particular individuals could complicate and destabilize these generalized concepts, resulting in hybrid identities and blurred community boundaries. So today I'd like to explore the way that generalized, or what I call macro-level concepts of the other, and particular or micro-level concepts or encounters with the other work together, hand in hand, in antiquity to both establish and contest the identity of Jews and others. Now, in developing my ideas, I draw on recent work by Adi Ophir and Ishai Rosenzweig. In their article, Goy, Toward a Genealogy, Ophir and Rosenzweig have described two critically important concepts in the Jewish construction of alterity. First, there is what they call the undifferentiated or uniform, generalized other, stereotype, I suppose, indicated by the term goy. In their words, quote, the concept of the goy divides humanity in a binary manner, separating Jews from all non-Jews, lumping the latter altogether in one group, unquote. This generalized other contains no internal diversity. Every goy is the same, and every goy is conceived as the fixed polar opposite of the Israelite or the Jew. Hand in hand with the generalized other, we find the construction of a very stable Jewish identity and the elimination of hybrid identities. It just ceases to happen in rabbinic literature, they say. Second, so that's one concept. Second, we have the concept of the differentiated or pluriform other, particular others, I should say. That's often indicated by the word goyim, nations, now in the plural. This other encompasses a diverse range of ethnic or religious sub-identities rather than a single uniform non-Jewish identity. This pluriform other is different from, but not the fixed polar opposite of the Israelite or the Jew. They're just different, but not exactly polar opposite. So hand in hand with the pluriform other, we find a destabilized Jewish identity because there might be points of commonality between self and other, and that opens up the possibility of sort of halfway identities, hybrid identities, fluid identities. Ophir and Rosenzweig have given us these two different kinds of other, and then they construct a diachronic account of the development of these two conceptions. One is earlier and one's later. Biblical and Second Temple period texts, they say, feature a pluriform concept of non-Jews as a collection of diverse peoples who are different from Jews, but not the polar opposite of Jews, and they're different in different ways, right? These texts, biblical texts, allow for hybrid identities and the blurring of community boundaries. They give as an example the biblical ger. According to them, the ger is a non-Jewish member of the covenant community. The second concept, the generalized uniform other that lumps all non-Jews into a single entity without any ethnic and religious differentiation and is just the polar opposite of the Jew. This goy is the invention of the Tannaitic rabbis of the 1st to early 3rd centuries with a little help from Paul, but I'm not going to go into that. So Ophir and Rosenzweig build their argument on changes in the meaning of the word goy. This is their research method is really to focus on this word and how it changes. The rabbis, they note, are the first to use the term in its grammatical singular form, goy, as a reference to a single non-Jewish individual, a goy, of fixed character, they argue. Biblically, the term goy doesn't mean this. It means nation, usually a foreign nation, but Israel too is a goy in the Bible. The shift from the biblical goy, meaning a nation among many national groups, or goyim, to the rabbinic goy, meaning an individual non-Jew who is the polar opposite of the Jew, created a strict binary in the rabbinic period. One was either a Jew or goy, no hybrid identities, and this led the rabbis to create conversion, a very clear process that just picked you up and moved you from one side of the binary to the other, no hybrid identity. And I hope I've represented them fairly. If one is interested in tracing the history of the term goy, then the conclusion that the rabbis used the term goy in a manner that's unattested in earlier literature is perfectly correct. However, as a history of the concept of an undifferentiated and generalized other, I'm not entirely persuaded by the argument. In order to elucidate a text's concept of the non-Jew, we can't confine ourselves to a single term. Rather, we must ask more broadly whether the text treats non-Jews as a single, static, universalized, undifferentiated class, regardless of the terminology that's employed. And even when multiple ethnic or religious subgroups might be labeled, are they still all being picked out and treated as one group? Or does the text treat different non-Jews in different ways based on a recognition of their internal ethnic or religious diversity? Well, when the rhetorical treatment of the non-Jew, rather than the specific term, is placed front and center, we find that the two concepts of the other that are so helpfully outlined by Ophir and Rosenzweig, I think they do us a great service by giving us these categories to think with. We find these two types of other function at one and the same time to define and redefine Jew and other. Like other human groups, ancient Jews held a macro-level concept of the other when establishing the boundaries of their own community and defining themselves. And these static macro-level constructions were continually destabilized by micro-level constructions that often represent direct encounters, whether real or imagined again, with particular individuals, often in narrative form. And this adds an element of dynamism to the maintenance of community boundaries. Rather than adopting the diachronic approach of Ophir and Rosenzweig, I propose then a synchronic approach, according to which both biblical and rabbinic literature contain both macro-level concepts of an undifferentiated and generalized other, even when the term goy is not employed. And I also show, I'm sorry, I've sort of messed up that sentence, so I will pretend I didn't. I will show that this happens in both biblical and rabbinic literature, right? You have this undifferentiated macro-level concept of the other, and you also have that being destabilized by micro-level constructions of particularized individual others. Certainly, Rosenzweig and Ophir are correct when they say that there are important differences between the biblical and rabbinic sources. Absolutely. The rabbis are more extreme, perhaps, in their representation of the static, undifferentiated goy. You know, there are differences in emphasis, there are differences, but they are differences in degree, I think, rather than differences in kind. So I'm going to begin with it. I didn't hand out that. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. I should give you a chunk of these. Holding on to them right for myself. Yaakov, yes, I'm here. The other person is a computer student. Sorry. So I'm going to begin with a test case that illustrates the dangers of a too narrow focus on terminology, and this is the test case of intermarriage. As Ophir, and so I'm sorry, so you had the handout, you could have seen all of these, this summary of their thesis. I apologize. So those quotes that I gave were on there, and that's a summary of their thesis. As they correctly point out, the Bible's treatment of the question of intermarriage with non-Jews does not, quote, erase the specific distinctions between various peoples and categories. There are different peoples surrounding Israel, and Deuteronomy's interest in each of them is differential and specific, right? Because remember, they want to claim that in the Bible you only have lots of different others. You don't have one other. Some foreign groups are banned, this is quite true. Others are not, while still others are banned only temporarily. So I've given you these sources, we won't read them. Deuteronomy 20, for example, permits the Israelites to take women from more distant nations as booty in wartime, but that explicitly is contrasted in Deuteronomy 20 with the women from the 7 Canaanite nations must be destroyed, right? Deuteronomy 23, I just underlined the relevant parts. You can see that Ammonites and Moabites are singled out for complete exclusion from the congregation of the Lord, marriage, and probably conversion if we have such a notion. While Egyptians and Edomites are excluded for only 3 generations. And these are always for reasons that pertain to Israel's specific historical experience with them. Marriage with many other non-Israelites, however, Phoenicians, Midianites, Ishmaelites, is nowhere prohibited in Deuteronomy. And this is quite consistent with narratives in the Pentateuch as well as in the Deuteronomistic history that depicted marriage, not infrequently, between various Israelites, including kings, including Moses, and their children are nonetheless Israelites. So we've got so many Israelite kings whose mothers were not Israelite, and nobody seems to care. In short, foreigners are not treated as one abstract universalized mass in the case of intermarriage, that's true. Rather than a universal prohibition of marriage with all foreigners, the Torah has different kinds of bans on a limited number of particular peoples. But intermarriage is taken up again in the biblical books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Now, according to Ophir and Rosenzweig, non-Jews are still conceived as a differentiated plurality in these books. They're not cast as a single entity in opposition to the Jew because we don't have the word goy functioning that way. They maintain that in his prohibition of intermarriage, Ezra, quote, assumes a plurality of goyim, unquote, and not simply a generalized other, as indicated by the fact that Ezra does not use a collective unified label, goy. Instead, he lists groups by their ethnic labels. You can see this on the third passage, right when he's over, he says, the peoples of the land are Ammonites and those whose practices are like them, and then he lists them, Canaanites, Hittites, Perizzites, Jebusites, etc., right? But there are 2 problems with this assertion. First, a mere listing of ethnic labels, as we have here, does not signal a pluriform conception of the other. If those listed are then treated in a uniform manner, it signals quite the opposite, that despite their ethnic variety, foreigners are at the base a single entity when it comes to the question of entering the Jewish community through marriage. In other words, I read Ezra as saying, all these people out there, Ammonites, Moabites, Shmoabites, you know, the whole bunch, all of them, they're all prohibited. Right? Very different from what's happening in Deuteronomy 23. So if we look, second, the absence of the term goy doesn't necessarily mean the absence of the concept of a generalized uniform non-Jew, because this idea can be expressed with other terminology. If we look at the way non-Jews function in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, we see that for the purposes of intermarriage, they function as a single uniform entity captured by the term, really, non-holy seed, right? The opposite of Ezra, Zerah Kodesh. So they are not the Zerah Kodesh, a binary opposition to Israel, which is holy seed. So where Deuteronomy contained different intermarriage rules for different foreigners, depending on Israel's different historical experiences with them, Ezra declares a uniform and universal prohibition of intermarriage that lists and then lumps all foreign groups together under the rubric of profane seed that cannot be mixed with the holy seed of Israel. Ophir and Rosenzweig assume that the list of nations in Ezra 9 resembles the list of nations in Deuteronomy 23. Both list a plurality of foreign groups. But rhetorically speaking, the list of nations in Ezra functions in precisely the opposite manner as the list in Deuteronomy 23, where they are mentioned by name in order to be differentiated. Ammonites and Moabites first, permanently prohibited. Egyptians and Edomites mentioned next, temporarily prohibited. Similarly, in Deuteronomy 20, we have different groups for the 2 different kinds of war captives. But in Ezra, the foreign nations are now listed precisely in order to, and in fact, they take the nations from all of these different lists, bring them all together, and they're all listed now precisely in order to erase their distinct identities and the distinct prohibitions referencing them. So instead of treating them as different entities subject to different marriage laws, Ezra assigns them all to the single uniform category of profane seed, standing in polar opposition to the holy seed of Israel. Intermarriage with any of them profanes the holy seed. So the boundary around the Israelite community for Ezra is predicated on this God-given and therefore fixed and immutable essence. It's not subject to human modification because it's divinely ordained. And that distinction then is utterly impermeable, categorical, binary. It doesn't allow for border crossing or for hybrid identities. It's true that the singular term goy does not appear in the book of Ezra, but it's equally true that Ezra does what Rosenzweig and Ophir claim isn't done by anyone until the rabbis. Ezra, quote, divides humanity in a binary manner. That's what they say of the rabbis. separating pure Israel from all other peoples of the land, lumped together into one group of non-holy seed in opposition to the holy seed of Israel. And this concept of the generalized and categorical other on the question of marriage into the community continues in the Second Temple Book of Jubilees, in the sectarian literature of Qumran. Here again, Ophir and Rosensky make the same argument, that because there's a lack of a single name for all others, and because they do list them by their ethnic groups, this is a sign that they still think of them in a variegated and pluriform way. But in fact, when you look at the rhetorical function of these groups in Jubilees and the sectarian literature, the opposite conclusion can be drawn. Here, too, ethnic designations are invoked and then subverted, as foreigners are listed and then treated as a single, undifferentiated mass on the question of incorporation into the community. And I think this happens in 4Q MMT as well. So even though these Second Temple texts do not have a single convenient term for the generalized other, and even though they sometimes contain lists of various ethnic groups, it's clear that they're capable of thinking in binary terms at the macro level of intermarriage and community formation. Israel and the nations are polar opposites ontologically, one holy seed and one profane seed. Any kind of border crossing or hybrid status is impossible on this view. This is where they'll differ from the rabbis. And yet Ophir and Rosensky claim that such a binary conception appears only for the first time in rabbinic texts. By contrast, consider the following rabbinic source, and this is the text now that I'm going to read completely differently from them again. This is number 4, Mishnah Yadayim. Hopefully most people know this text. I'll summarize it so we can get through it more quickly. You have this Ammonite convert who comes, so it's interesting, they call him an Ammonite ger, right, an Ammonite convert. He comes and to the house of study, and he wants to marry an Israelite. So presumably he is some sort of convert already, but he's observing this non-marriage into the community. Rabbi Gamliel says, you're forbidden. Rabbi Yoshua says, you're permitted. Rabbi Gamliel says, wait a minute, there's Deuteronomy 23. It says, no Ammonite shall marry. And Rabbi Joshua says, but do we even know who Ammonites are anymore? All the nations have been mixed up ever since the wars, so we really don't know who they are anymore. Rabbi Gamliel throws back a verse at him that says, yes, we do. There's a verse that says that God has restored everybody. And Rabbi Yoshua says, oh, really? He also said he was going to restore you to your land, and he hasn't done that for us yet. So I doubt that he's even restored the Ammonites. So everyone gets the picture, right? Now, Ophir and Rosensky interpret this text as, quote, deliberately erasing the distinction between various groups in favor of the construction of a single unified goy, unquote. But I think the text does no such thing. This particular individual's conversion and marriage are allowed, not because the distinction between prohibited Ammonites and permitted foreigners has been erased, but because in Rabbi Yoshua's view, this still valid distinction just can't be applied to the particular case in question. He doesn't have an identity card, and since the identity of this particular individual as a pure-blood Ammonite cannot be determined with certainty, Rabbi Yoshua is prepared to give him the benefit of the doubt and place him in a class of foreigners who are permitted to convert and intermarry. In other words, the biblical differentiation of various foreign groups to whom different marriage rules apply, some prohibited and some permitted, remains intact for the rabbis, even as they claim that their ability to apply those rules is compromised by historical developments, wink, wink, that have created ambiguity. We don't know who anybody is anymore. I have no doubt this is a legal fiction and a ruse. I'm not, naive here. But that the categories are still operative is seen by the fact that there's a machloket at all about whether or not they should be applied to this specific individual. Rabbi Gamliel's response to the epistemological uncertainty of the case is to err on the side of caution. Well, let's just apply the category as if we knew we were an Ammonite. And Rabbi Yoshua says, no, my response to the epistemological uncertainty is to err on the side of leniency and not apply the status, since the man's status is indeterminable. And it's the latter, very clever and opportunistic response that wins the day, and the boundary crossing event is allowed. And here, I really think this is the stronger reading, and I was so happy you brought the Acts 10 case, because there we have what I think Ophir and Rosensky want to see here. There you have the only person who can remove this prohibition, God, coming down and saying, it's okay, people I called pure and impure, forget it. And now you don't have to do that anymore. The only person who can change that ontologically, divinely given status in Deuteronomy 23 is God himself. And that's the text that they're looking for, that does this, that just erases the distinction. The only person who can do it is God, not Rabbi Yoshua. So he keeps the distinction, but he finds a way to work around them. This test case has shown that on the important question of the permeability of community boundaries, Ophir and Rosenzweig's evolutionary account of the concept of the goy as a generalized and undifferentiated entity or other is difficult to sustain. On the one hand, we have the generalized, undifferentiated concept already in some biblical and Second Temple literature, Ezra, Nehemiah, and the Jubilees, and 4QMNT, and others. On the other hand, the rabbinic source that I cited here assumes that the distinction among these different foreign groups remains, even if we don't put it into practice anymore, and they're willing to open a window for a more permissive approach on the question of border crossing and hybrid identity. So I propose instead an alternative account of the relationship between the two concepts so helpfully given to us by Ophir and Rosenzweig. They are not consecutive, they are simultaneous, and I'm going to argue necessarily so. There's a dialectic tension between the generalized and particular, between the macro level and the micro level constructions of identity and alterity in both biblical and rabbinic literature, and I think in every culture actually. So I will just make the following claims in my remaining time. First, Pache, Ophir, and Rosenzweig, you have a generalized binary conception of Israelites and non-Israelites as a fundamental feature of the Bible's construction of Israelite identity, its macro-level construction of Israelite identity. That generalized binary conception is repeatedly destabilized and contested at the micro level with sort of particular characters and stories that have hybrid identities and cross the boundary. And third, that same dialectic, although with different emphasis and character, is found in rabbinic literature. It just continues. First, the macro-level construction of an Israelite, non-Israelite binary in biblical sources. Here I'll be very brief, and we won't read the sources. They're there for you to enjoy at home. But in several key texts, Israelite identity is defined in opposition to the other nations, plural, as a single collective. And that's achieved through separation, as indicated by the word kadosh, which I think is the more important word to focus on here. Kadosh, the root meaning of it is, of course, set apart, separated, or withdrawn from ordinary use. The biblical sources point to two kinds of kedusha, holiness. I refer to these as covenantal holiness and designated holiness. The earliest articulation of covenantal holiness is found in Exodus 19, verses 1 through 6. I've given it here. But if Israel obeys God's covenant, then Israel will be an Am Kadosh, they'll be a holy nation, meaning a nation separated out from all other nations to God. You shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So the criterion for membership in the holy nation is aspirational. It's something to be achieved through covenant observance. It's non-biological, therefore, and so the boundary around the community is permeable and border crossings are permitted. Moses, Israel's kings, others produce fully Israelite children with foreign wives. So while identity, this is the important part, this is why they're different from Jubilees and sectarian literature. While identity is explicitly predicated on a binary opposition between Israel and other nations, you shall be my treasured possession among all the peoples, a clear binary of Israel and the other nations, it's nevertheless dynamic and not static. The earliest articulation of designated holiness, the second kind of holiness, is in Deuteronomy 7 and repeated elsewhere in Deuteronomy. It's a different kind of holiness from Exodus 19. Here, Israel is designated by God as a holy nation. It's a fixed status conferred at the moment of selection and separation. It sort of precedes the covenant and is part of a discourse of separation that presupposes a basic binary between those with whom one may mix, one's own community, and those with whom one may not mix, the generalized mass of humanity outside one's community, and that holy separation is marked and preserved through ritual practices unique to Israel. Everybody else eats pork, you don't eat pork, right? Things that are explicitly designed to keep Israel kadosh. Why are the dietary laws preceded and concluded? You will be holy, don't eat these things. You will be holy, it means you will be separate, don't eat these things, you'll be separate. And finally then, as we've seen, Israel's holiness is later configured genealogically, and I've just cited Malachi here at the top of your almost last page. And in Ezra and Nehemiah, right, these are texts that construct an ontologically real binary of holy seed that precludes boundary crossing altogether. And yet, alongside these macro-level constructions of Jewish identity, Jewish community, are micro-level contestations of identity and alterity that destabilize these macro-level binaries. The ger is just such a micro-level contestation. I don't agree with Ophir and Rosenzweig that the ger is a non-Jewish member of the covenant community. I think they're a foreigner who resides within Israel. They observe many, but not all of Israel's laws. They partake voluntarily of some cultic rites, and they're guaranteed civic equality, but they're not fully assimilated. They therefore have a hybrid status. They participate in two identity formations at the same time. That's what a hybrid status is. There are other contestations of the macro-level binary of Israelite and non-Israelite, in biblical narratives in particular. This binary is destabilized, and I'm just going to summarize quickly. First of all, by non-Israelite characters who are incorporated into the community, such as Tamar, a Canaanite who outperforms Judah in fulfilling the obligation to continue her dead Israelite husband's line. Or secondly, by non-Israelite characters who retain their foreign status, but they possess traits of character that are expected of Israelites, such as Yitro, Jethro, the Midianite, who praises the God of the Israelites. He counsels and aids them. He even gives his daughter to them in marriage, right? So he's a father-in-law to now one among them, right? So he's related to them, but he's said at the end of the story to return to his own country, unquote. Or, thirdly, by non-Israelite characters who occupy a truly hybrid status. They retain their ethnic label, even as they are grafted into the community. The classic case being Ruth, who, in defiance of Deuteronomy 23's prohibition of Moabites, marries into the community and becomes the great-grandmother of King David, but still in the closing verse of the book of Ruth is referred to as Ruth HaMoaviyah, the Moabite. The rabbis will convert her, but in the Bible, she's Ruth HaMoaviyah until the end. Likewise, in rabbinic literature, we have the same duality. The generalized and undifferentiated, it's kind of, can I have 5 more minutes because it's a cool list? I didn't start truthfully until I got 7 past. So technically, I think I've been 23 minutes.
It's so wonderful to
it's
get
so
on different strike.
It's so wonderful.
Cut you off here.
And we've referred to it so many times. So this is just some cool stuff from Avodah Zarah. So we have these macro-level concepts of the non-Jew as the polar opposite of the Jew in rabbinic literature, and at the same time, and it now has acquired the convenient label of goy. That's nice. I now have shorthand for it. And that particular goy, and that goy is definitely a more extreme and more polarized character than its sort of structural equivalents in the Bible, maybe, with the exception of Ezra and Nehemiah, perhaps. But it's not in itself a new phenomenon. It's just gained a label, and it's perhaps a little more starkly drawn. And even so, in rabbinic literature, it's still accompanied by micro-level contestations. The rabbinic convert is one micro-level contestation, I think, as are non-Jewish individuals who adopt behaviors and possess traits of character expected of Israelites rather than non-Israelites, and thus exemplify various degrees of informal hybridity, with or without actual conversion. A couple of quick examples will suffice. And here I want to refer to a wonderful dissertation. This is where these examples are mostly from, by Mira Beth Wasserman, I referred to earlier. She analyzes the dialectic tension in Talmudic tractate Avodah Zarah between passages that emphasize the absolute otherness of non-Jews and passages that affirm commonalities among peoples. And as she points out, the laws in the Mishnah, right, in Mishnah Avodah Zarah, these laws erect social boundaries between Jews and non-Jews that are based on a harsh characterization of the non-Jew as basically prone to sexual depravity, violence, deception. It's a unified negative portrayal that's very much in line with Ophir and Rosenzweig's Goy. Now, of course, I will point out that law as a genre tends to speak at the macro level of generalized and static abstractions, and rabbinic halakha is no exception. Nevertheless, in its wide-ranging commentary on the Mishnah, the more generically diverse Babylonian Talmud brings the Mishnah's macro-level generalizations about non-Jews into conversation with Tannaitic and post-Tannaitic traditions that resist and destabilize them. As Wasserman shrewdly discerns, the tractate begins with the well-known eschatological narrative in which the nations are summoned at the end of days. They're uniformly condemned for their failure to busy themselves with Torah. They're precluded from life in the world to come. But the tractate ends, some 76 folio pages later, with the story of a non-Jewish king, Shapur, who outdoes his Jewish guest in his concern that Jews busy themselves with Torah. Moreover, in addition to a teaching that equates the non-Jew who studies Torah with the high priest, we find between the first and the last stories of Tractate Avodah Zarah a number of other stories in which individual non-Jews with names disrupt the negative image of the Goy that permeates the Mishnah. Specifically, the non-Jew Kti'ah Bar Shalom is condemned to death for resisting the king's evil intentions regarding the Jews. At the last moment, he circumcises himself, and a heavenly voice announces that he has attained to life in the world to come. Despite the fact that the opening scene, God sits there saying, none of you are going to have life in the world to come. You didn't busy yourselves with Torah. This K'tia Bar Shalom, it's announced he's attained to life in the world to come. Similarly, the Roman executioner of Rabbi Hanina ben Teradion is moved by his encounter with the pious Rabbi Hanina to hasten the martyr's execution and then jump into the fire himself, after which a heavenly voice announces that both Rabbi Hanina and his Roman executioner have attained to the world to come. And that story I've given you here. We may compare these two stories to the story of the Jewish penitent Elazar ben Dordi, I think you've heard of him, who is accepted to heaven after a life of heinous sin. Regarding all three, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi is said to have weepily declared, there is one who acquires the world to come in a single hour, and there is one who acquires the world to come over many years. Wasserman concludes, pious rabbi, righteous Gentile, debauched Jew, they're a disparate group by any measure, but especially against the backdrop of a tractate that ostensibly aims to erect boundaries between Jews and Gentiles, and that opens with a vision of the non-Jewish nations as utterly irredeemable. This network of stories accentuates the commonalities among rabbis and sinners, Jews and Gentiles. The micro-level contestations of the Negev Goy in the tractate continues with the story of Dama ben Tina, a non-Jew who's extolled as a model of filial piety because he chose to sacrifice a tremendous fortune rather than disturb his sleeping father. He was willing to endure public humiliation at the hands of his mother without complaint. And in the final story of the tractate, the Persian king Shapur, and I think I've given this as well, embarrasses Bati Bartuvi, one of his Jewish visitors, by casting aspersions on his Jewishness. He does this by purifying the knife used to cut the food of Mar Yehuda, but conspicuously choosing not to do so for Bati Bartuvi, on the grounds that the latter's identity as a Jew is in doubt because of his lack of commitment to Jewish religious practice or his immoral behavior. It's not really clear what he's referring to there. Rashi knows, but I'm not so sure. In the opening story, the claim of the Romans and Persians to have established the condition, they come and they say, wait, we did everything we did to make it possible for Jews to study Torah. That claim was rejected laughingly by God. But in the final story, the Persian king Shapur is shown to be doing exactly this, chastising Jews who are failing to observe their own Torah. He's not doing it himself, but he's making it possible for them. So to conclude, both biblical and rabbinic literature feature a dialectic tension between a macro-level representation of the non-Jew as a universalized other who's the polar opposite of the Jew, and micro-level representations of the non-Jew as a particular other who exhibits points of similarity to and difference from the Jew that facilitates a range of associations from sympathy to hybridity to conversion. The question for future research is not which representation occurs in which literature, but given that both occur in both biblical and rabbinic literature, then when and why is one employed in a given instance? Are abstract generalizations employed more frequently in legal sources, because this is the genre of legal literature? When does a narrative employ a stock stereotype of a non-Jew? When does it employ a specific and particular non-Jew who disturbs the stock stereotype? Finally, I will just say that the synchrony, the simultaneity of these two modes of representation, these two kinds of other, is, in my view, inevitable. In fact, it's impossible for things to be otherwise. Identity formation requires the construction of another, usually in stock generalized terms that simply do not map onto the messy reality in which we live. But the construction of an identity binary makes it possible in the first place for us to imagine its violation through border crossings and hybridity. The static binary therefore generates its own binary disruption. And at the same time, the disruptions make visible and reinforce the otherwise static and partly invisible binaries, reaffirming the very identity that they ostensibly disrupt. It's simply impossible to have one without the other. Thank you.
Thank you so much for such a rich and clear paper on complications.
Thank you.
It's really astonishing. So, questions? Here's one. Second one.
Well, thank you. That was awesome. I want to make two points. One, it's very interesting that the first story in Avodah Zarah, well, the assumption, I don't know the dissertation, but it sounds like the assumption is that there is a literary structure to this.
She makes it very clear in her methodology. I'm going to do a literary reading of the Talmud, right, so explicitly.
I have a problem with that, but if you go along that line,
right.
What's interesting is that you start the tractate with a story about all the nations, right? Saying we allow Jews to study Torah, and then God laughs at them, none of you did it for you. But it ends with King Bahu, the Persians.
That's Persian.
And it's found in the Babylonian Talmud. So it's not, the Roman didn't take care of Torah,
Absolutely.
but the Persian take care of us.
Absolutely.
And that feeds into the national patriotism of the Bavli. We, and that of course that's a story that's going to go all the way to the superiority of 9th century, 9th time. We are allowed to study Torah as opposed to the Roman.
Absolutely.
I think that's beautiful if
And
you
she
read it
does,
literally.
and she does make
If
that
you
point.
read it literally.
Yeah, no, but she also does, make
she
those
makes
points
that out.
as well.
That's a good point.
And then, but of course, one of the stories is a Roman executioner, the
Oh,
most
wait, so-
hated, and the person who, actually executes your most pious rabbi, and he gives a place in the world to come. That's picking a real hated character too.
But he doesn't take care of the Jews.
No, he
So that's
doesn't. So that's why it's a
that's
nice
different.
bookend,
Yeah.
right? It's a nice bookend.
Wait, that's point number one. Point number two is so at the end of the day, you say you're looking at it very simplistically with the goy because your methodology is wrong. You're looking on only the term goy.
Oh, you meaning?
Hey, Shia was Enzvi and
No, they're doing us a great favor by helping us understand the word goy.
Yes. So that's what I want to ask you.
Yeah.
So I think you have raised our head above and say, but you're through the philological search of the word goy, you're dealing with a bigger question, and the bigger question that doesn't work with your thesis, right?
In other words, what I'm saying is you can't go from terminology to concept because
okay.
concepts are captured sometimes by multiple terminologies. So if you looked at one term, you haven't.
So that's what I wanted to ask. What do you do with the term? So it's still interesting that they found
Absolutely.
this element with the term specifically goy.
Right.
There's something interesting happening here
Absolutely.
from earlier period to later period, specifically with the term goy. So
Absolutely.
you would allow that
No,
development
I say
to
that. I
happen
said it
in
very
the goy.
explicitly. I would not debate. Look, this is like a dictionary entry, right? You can't deny this is how a word gets used. So I think this is just a fact on the table. And to some extent, people have talked about that already in the past, that we see the word goy being used in the Bible one way and the changes in rabbinic literature. That's not so new, but they do the thorough work of really, showing that this is the case. What I'm not happy with is the way that is understood to then exhaust ancient conceptions of the other. There are just other ways to talk about the other insults that you can throw at them, right? Or other terminology. What's so other about you is the fact that your Zera is not so Kodesh. So that's what's other about you. Not that you're another nation, but that you're a different genealogy. I capture your otherness with that term. So you haven't captured everything about what people think about otherness by looking at one term.
Okay, thank you.
So thank you very much for a fascinating paper. I was a little bit hesitating whether I would should ask this question because I think there is an elephant in the room. And some of us, I think almost every paper came a little bit to this point and to the point that this creation of otherness or so always has to do with the creation of identities or group identities. The problem, however, is what do we mean with the word identities? So there are so many different discussions.
Whatever's not the other.
Yeah. No, but there's, at least in Germany we have at the moment a growing discussion about the term, what do we mean with identity, and in how far are we still allowed to speak about group identities or so. And I think this is a question which should could be a question to almost every paper we had here, and I think it is a question which will be important for also for something like an introduction to the to the whole volume or so. Would you like to say a little bit more about your idea of
So
what you...
I don't want to appear to be someone who perhaps has not examined something I ought to examine, but for me this is just a given. I assume that if we're talking about the other, we are talking about oneself, and that's why I opened the paper that way.
Mm-hmm.
That other and self, identity and alterity, to me those go hand in hand. So I think every act of identifying the other is an act of constructing one's own identity, but what I think is so important to understand is that that doesn't lock you into a static conception.
Mm-hmm.
That I think all cultures are constructing multiple overlapping identities of themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that sounds really weird. People think of identity as a very stable and fixed thing. I don't think it is. I think we sometimes talk about it that way precisely just to give us a base to keep troubling it, just to give us some sort of baseline concept that we then just keep redefining, shifting, moving, right? So Ezra's going to take something and he's going to say, well, of course there's Israel and there's others, but the way you've been defining is letting in too many people I don't like. You've been defining it as people who just agree to the covenant, but that's in letting in a whole bunch of people who aren't speaking Hebrew, right? And you've been defining it as a way, as people who are just agree to certain kinds of practices that are separate from others. But again, that's letting in people I don't like. I'm going to define it in a way that creates, pushes the demographic that it captures a little bit differently to get a group of people that I'm happier with. So, but they would all still say that it's Israelite identity, or each one of them will still claim. And this came up in somebody else's paper, right? Each one would still understand themselves as being Israel. Whoever, So identity is, I think, always being negotiated, even by one particular group at any given time, through the encounters and the experiences that they have, real or imagined. Other people, though, should weigh in. Everybody talked about identity over the last 2 days, so really everybody could say something about this.
I haven't.
Actually, I wanted to say that your paper was about identity.
I don't use the word.
No, I know you don't use the word, but I mean,
but it was, of course, if you have struggle about the past and about what is the future and about what is the function, I think this is so it's something like.
It's just because while preparing the ERC interview, I was challenged on the notion of identity, and I came to read an article by a sociologist together with a historian, Frederick Cooper and Brubaker, who's a sociologist, deconstructing in a very strong way the very concept of collective identity, and showing, for examples that have to do with Japan and modern things, that it's in each case you have a better concept than identity, and you could use self-definition because identity in itself, it's the idea. The etymology means that it's not changing. So you have a paradox.
So that's
why people keep talking about evolving identity, complex identities. But there is a paradox. And the word identity means that you remain the same, which we disagree with. I mean, I agree with you.
Right,
it's not stable. So they make a strong case for not using the word identity in our work, in the humanities. I'm just
identity
saying,
with an asterisk. To me, it's like the word influence. All of a sudden, we're not allowed to talk about influence anymore. But I keep thinking, but when I use the word influence, I meant all those complicated things that everybody says that's not what influence is. Influence is from A to B. It's like, no, I always thought of influence as this very rich and negotiated thing. It's the same with identity for me. I think of it as this complex, thing. So
words are tricky, and I really liked your points on the fact that it's in a way wrong to focus only on word. And Boyarin has the same problem when he just focuses on religio and treskeia. And he looks for all the texts that use religio and treskeia. He says it doesn't work, so we don't have a religion. We don't have Jewish religion. Because we don't have the word for, we don't have Yahadut in the Second Temple prayer. I think it's too narrow a way of asking the question. I really liked the way you took this distance from the very interesting investigation of Ishai and Adi, but just, looking at things. And I heard a lecture by Yair Furstenberg about the Samaritans in Rabbinic sources, which was also in a way a response to the paper on the Goy, because it showed that the Samaritans are
hybrid.
So hybrid and so difficult to put in a particular category for the rabbis. So it was a fascinating answer to the Goy paper.
The longer version of this, so now I'll make sure I look at Yair, because the longer
it's not
version
published
of
yet
this,
because it's in a volume I'm editing.
I will talk. I will definitely talk. But no,
I can ask him if I can send it.
And there will definitely be a section on this going through all of the various hybrid categories, these Kutians and Samaritans and other groups that they construct. And there's even one text which talks about Chad Parsi, a certain Persian who's clearly a Jew because he's asking about the blessing and he has to say, but he's called a Persian. I mean, so there's really interesting.
In one story about the meaning, the Chulin story I told about, there's all of a sudden there's the bad mean, which we argue with. All of a sudden a second mean shows up and he eats with the rabbi, which never happened, and he's a good mean, and halakha is determined by him. So all of a sudden you have all those hybrid.
So we are almost shifting towards the conclusion of the conference, which is great. Which is really great. That's what we want to do here. But we have two more questions on the paper here and okay.
I'll just say quick. I think with still have the notion of looking at the concept, even if there's not a term, I think is really strong, especially, and I think even with the Esther passage, you could even make it even stronger, because it talks about the peoples of the land, Amei Ha'aretzot.
Sure.
And then it says who's abhor and practice here are like those of the, and then it lists them first, and I think that like does
that
correspond.
like functions that
So
way,
it's sort of,
doesn't it? Yeah,
the
that's
key
right.
term here is actually
That's nice.
the Amei Ha'aretzot, which is a general term.
That's nice.
They don't even have a name.
That's
They're
right.
like all these other people, and then notably it puts the Egyptians in there who, in Deuteronomy were different. So it lists them all together, and even the Amei Ha'aretzot aren't even
I think you're right. That stresses
those
it even
people.
more.
And I think there's something, if you look at even in the later Rabbinic Aleinu with the Goyei Ha'aretzot, also as a general term, already there seems to be something here that the Israel's not one of the peoples of the land. There's something, it's a qualitative difference.
Right.
So there's
And I
something
mean,
there.
they argue that, well, here they're really talking about other Jews, right, who are peoples of the land, who are like these others. So this shows there's still differentiation. And I'm thinking, no, they're throwing all of, they happen to be throwing some of their own people out into that category.
Right, yeah. That's it.
Right? But it's still one category.
I'll take his last spot. I just wanted to underscore again, because this is what I do, how much in the New Testament you could find the generalized binary, which is then contested at the micro level. I mean, another couple of examples would be, after a very negative portrayal of Gentiles, you actually have one of Jesus's killers who comes to faith. It's a climactic moment in Mark, and also in Matthew and Luke. You could read Paul.
Is it a spoiler if I ask who it is?
The centurion.
Oh, thank you.
Truly, this man was God's son.
I guess I should know that.
And Paul and Deutero
So it's
Paul.
a Roman executioner.
Right.
That's nice.
Right. And crucially in Mark, he's the.
I'll come back.
Yeah.
I want to say something about it.
That's nice. That's
He's the first person, whether he gets it or like the audience is supposed to get it through him, doesn't really matter right now. It's the first time anyone's ever understood who Jesus was in the whole narrative. I mean, even the apostles haven't gotten it, but they're still, like this the account that Matt looked at yesterday, that still all stands. They're still bad, basically bad. But then the first person that you could also read, Paul loves the generalized binary, and also Deutero Paul. But it'd be interesting. You could read all of Romans as starting out in chapter 1 by setting out the binary in the strongest possible terms. Then he starts deconstructing it. He pushes it so far that you start to think, and some people still think, that he obliterates it, until you get to the end of the letter and you find out it's still there. And in chapter 11, as we've discussed a couple of times. Yeah. But it'd be an interesting kind of metric to run through the whole letter.
Thank you so much.
I just want to talk about executions for a second.
Okay.
No. There is a
Logical end.
This is really the end.
No, but there is a point that just helps explain the story that you brought about the executioner. The skill of executioners is understood until more recent times was to make the process as agonizing and as slow as possible. And therefore, what? The world and all that, that's all meant to prolong the life of the person who's being sent out of this world. And therefore, when the executioner turns around and says, I'm going to do it the other way and make it faster, that is an act of, I would call it in Hebrew chesed, that deserves some sort of acknowledgement. So that when you understand that this was supposed to be the great skill of executioners, to make it harder and harder, this turns the tables on it.
But it's a redundancy in the story, because he was promised to get Olam Haba before he jumped to the fire. He said, if I'll take the wool,
Yeah, he doesn't if then.
the jumping into the fire in the Avodah Zarah is not explained in the story, because he gets the Olam Haba without jumping into the fire.
No, but one
He
second.
wants to get it.
No,
But if I'm
one
merciful,
moment,
he gets it
one
first.
second. Since he has been promised Olam Haba, in order to get it, he's got to leave this world as soon as possible.
No, he can get it when he dies.
Quit while you're ahead.
Quit while you're ahead.
Okay, but I'm saying it because there's certain kind of violence towards the goy, even though he's a nice goy, they're killing him. Even though he doesn't have to die in the story, they're killing him. In order to be one of us, he has to die. He cannot stay a goy and be one of us. He has to die.
Yeah, it happens in his extraordinarily dramatic, and I don't know. So Ketia Bar Shalom circumcises himself,
Yeah.
and then is killed.
In
I mean,
the
it's-
manuscript,
it's,
he's done it very violently
right.
with the teeth. Actually.
Well, and you know, and the word Ketia implies ripping or tearing or something. Yeah. So it is very violent.
Final moment is.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot
Violent,
for
violence,
the paper.